Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about tiering all of the conference realignment teams. Definitely some teams that are fully ready to compete, maybe even win the conference in their first year. A couple of teams that might just be right in the middle of that conference for a little bit, and then some teams that are just going to have to build up to the top of that conference. But let's get into Will Johnson and let's talk about his big-time plans that he might have for this upcoming season. It sounds like Will Johnson wants to be kind of a Charles Woodson prototype, maybe a 2.0, if you will. He wants to be a two-way player for Michigan. He has made that very clear over his time at Michigan, was a wide receiver in high school, and a darn good one, honestly. I'll break that down a little bit later, but there's definitely a lot to go into this. This is obviously what Will Johnson wants. He really wants to play both ways. He wants to be a part of this offense, and it sounds like some of his teammates are more than on board for him to do that, but Sherrone Moore seems to be a little bit more hesitant, which makes total sense when you have a guy that is likely going to be a first-round draft pick at corner. I don't know how inclined you'd be to put him out there on offense as well. But at the end of the day, this would be an incredible thing to talk about. It would be absolutely wild to see what he would be able to do at the wide receiver position. And I think when you look at this Michigan team, there's some validity to what he's saying. This kid is an outright athlete. There's no two ways about that. 6'2", 202 frame. He can play wide receiver. There's no question about that. He was the number 3 cornerback in the 2022 class, but also had 666 yards his senior season, had 635 from rushing attempts and punt returns. He also got 600 yards in his junior year catching the ball. So the kid can play wide receiver. He just hasn't in a very long time. Since he's got onto Michigan's campus, it's been all about corner. It's been all about doing that type of thing. Now, it doesn't mean there hasn't been kind of some mix-up to where people play. I mean, Mike Sanders is probably the best example. Moved from wide receiver to cornerback and never looked back. One of the best nickelbacks from a year ago, and definitely I expect at least for him to have a very good NFL career. But it's going to be interesting to watch this unfold because I think when we go into this season, we all know that Michigan needs guys to step up at the wide receiver position. You need, whether it's Tyler Morris or Samaje Morgan or some other guys that have kind of come on as young players on that team, you're going to need someone, right? And you're going to need kind of a spark on that offensive side of the ball. And frankly, I see a reality where maybe let's say week 2, they play Texas, and Texas comes into their house, and maybe it's not his best day. Alex Orji, that is. Maybe he doesn't throw the ball too well. Maybe he misses a couple of guys. Maybe even better, well, not even better for Michigan fans, but in this argument, maybe he throws a couple of beautiful passes and they bounce off the receiver's hands into Texas players' hands. Maybe there's some mistakes in route running and communication problems and all of that type of thing. I would be a head coach. I mean, if I were in that position, it'd be really hard for me to not look at one of the best, maybe the best athlete we have on this team and say, you know what, why not? Take a couple of snaps, let's see what happens, let's see if you fit into this offense, and then we'll go from there. So it's one of those things that, frankly, right now I have not a ton of optimism that we'll be able to see him on both sides of the ball. As much as I want that to happen, I don't necessarily think that's in the cards, at least as of right now. It could be very quickly, because I think we all understand this passing offense isn't going to be like prolific. They're not going to do anything absolutely incredible, but at the end of the day, you need guys that can catch the ball. The thing that J.J. McCarthy benefited from greatly was he had Roman Wilson, he had Cornelius Johnson, 2 guys that you felt pretty confident when he was throwing them the ball because they were such sure-handed, really experienced guys that it made life a little bit easier. And Will Johnson obviously would not necessarily be that scenario, but sometimes you just need a spark. Sometimes you just need a new face, a new target for the quarterback to look at, and maybe it works out. So it would be fascinating to see what happens. Obviously, we talked about Roman Wilson and Cornelius Johnson finding their way out, but they also had Christian Dixon, they had Carmelo English, they had Darius Clemens all find their way into the portal, and English and Clemens in particular were just huge guys coming out of high school, definitely would have been players for them going forward. But now they're kind of stuck with Samaje Morgan, who had just over 200 yards catching a year ago, Tyler Morris just under 200 yards, and then Frederick Moore was a kind of standout in their spring game, will likely be the third starter there. He had 32 yards a year ago. So in most, you're returning probably about 30 catches, about, 400 yards of offense from a year ago in terms of pass catching, and that is not ideal by any means. Obviously, you're not going to be the most pass-heavy team in the world, but you're going to need to be able to throw the ball. They did add someone in the portal, and it was a, really solid player, to be totally honest. They brought in a guy from Youngstown called CJ Charleston, was not necessarily that highly rated in the portal. Let's be totally honest, with all of the wide receivers that came in, a very talented guy. I think it's going to be really interesting to see kind of where this guy fits in. He had 503 yards from a FCS program a year ago, Youngstown State, and was actually at Michigan in the first place. Was a wide receiver turned cornerback, left Michigan, found his way back to Michigan after all of this craziness that he's been through, and is likely going to be back at wide receiver. So it'll be fascinating to watch if he's someone that can, really make some strides into that. So we talked about Mike Sandrill moving from wide receiver to nickelback, so it's not all that crazy, at least under Jim Harbaugh, and likely will be the same type of business under Sharon Moore. But you also had Khalil Mullings. He moved from, reserve linebacker to a really good running back. That's going to help them out this year. You also have Max Bredesen. He was a high school quarterback that turned into a really, really good H-back, tight end, fullback, whatever you want to call him. A very, very good player nonetheless. So there's a lot to like about this team, and there's a lot to like about possibly the fit of Will Johnson finding his way over to the offensive side of the ball, because I think there's this need at Michigan to have that game-changing guy. Now, last year you had Blake Corum. Last year you had Donovan Edwards. You had Roman Wilson. You had Cornelius Johnson. None of those guys, in my mind at least, were like the explosive, electric player that you're used to having on these championship level teams. They wore teams down. They played really good football. It's not to say that, those guys aren't remarkably talented. It's just to say they didn't gash teams by any means, but they were going to wear you down. And I think the best way they did that was no one really, had to stay on the field for too long. No one had to kind of push themselves in one direction too long in that offense. It felt like there were a lot of moving parts. There was a lot of rotation in between. There was a lot of running the ball. So the wide receivers and stuff got to take some plays off and got to kind of regroup for another play down the road. I think this year is going to be a little bit interesting because you don't have the Roman Wilsons, the Cornelius Johnsons of the world, where when you do have to get in these passing scenarios, they're ready to go. You're now handing the reins over to guys like Tyler Morris, guys like Samaje Morgan, who I really like both those guys. I think they're both very talented, and honestly, I think there'll be plenty in the passing game. But at the end of the day, you never really know until you get on the field. And there's a reality where you get to week 2, and some of these guys are just getting absolutely blanketed in coverage, and you can't get anyone open, and the run game maybe struggles a little bit because Texas can start packing the box and doing some things that on defense they wouldn't normally do against some other teams. So it is kind of that double-edged sword, right? You don't want to put Will Johnson in danger. You kind of want to protect him from himself in this scenario of playing probably too many snaps. I think all of us can agree Travis Hunter is an absolute anomaly. Even though I would love to see Will Johnson on both sides of the ball, I'd be a little bit shocked if he could play 115 snaps. Now, not to say he can't, or not to say it's not in the cards, but I'd be a little bit surprised. I think he definitely has a ton of ability and definitely could be a huge help to this team, but likely the best help he can be to this team is as a corner and sticking as a corner. But it would be awesome to watch. I'll just put it that way. It's definitely something that I want, just because if I can sit down and watch Michigan and have that really fun player on the field at most all times, I'm likely going to do it a lot of the time. It's kind of the Travis Hunter of the world, where you don't know how well Colorado is going to play as a team. Travis Hunter is going to make a play or two. And Michigan is going to be a good team that also has this guy on it. So it would be an incredible thing to watch. I think there are plenty of people around the country who saw this and immediately ran to their coaches trying to make it happen. I'd be a little bit surprised if Will Johnson ended up making that jump, but maybe there's some dire straits that come into play, whether it's week 2 or a couple of weeks down the road. Maybe they just don't play all that well on offense the first couple of weeks, and they're just looking for anything. And maybe the Will Johnson just pops up and makes some big plays. But it'll be fascinating to watch. I really hope this is something that actually happens. But if I was a betting man, I would bet it would be Will Johnson at corner all year, no question. Maybe he'll play a couple offensive snaps, but I wouldn't necessarily bet too much on it by any means. But it'll be an awesome thing to watch. Definitely love when two-way players come into our sport because it's appointment television, that's for sure. But let's take a break here. When we come back, let's talk about the ACC. We've gone through every other Power 4 conference. Now it's time for the ACC win totals and Cinderella segment. So we'll do that. We'll do win totals first and then Cinderellas in segment 4. But we'll take a quick break, and then after that, we'll get into win totals for the ACC.